Well, it looks like you do. Yes.
Uh, yes, hi.
Welcome
Well,
to Pandooradom. I'm Paul
yes,
Cradle, and this is my co-host.
Miles Gray. Thank you for joining us, fellow Pandooranauts, on today's episode. Where do we find you, Paul? It seems like you're either a very small ant under a tuft of grass, or you're in some kind of jungle and you're regular sized.
Oh, today I'm in my regular size in the jungle. Although not too long ago I was an ant, believe it or not. so, 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 Miles, I promised, especially promised by me, we were going to talk about your public access channel program, and I'll segue to that in just a minute. Bringing up first something I didn't bring up about my middle school news team experience. I mentioned that they didn't do any feature stories the whole year long because that would have required actual work and planning and not dingbat stuff, right? So what they were planning, especially the five girls, was a show in the morning called Behind, or a segment, like a feature segment of the morning, of our morning news, that was called Behind the Scenes of
Okay.
WOCO, which basically just meant like they would turn the cameras backwards or something and just expose how we produced
Wow.
WOCO from
Oh, that's
the
amazing.
from the uh from the AV room. But what's worse, Miles, they
Yes.
said they were going to go overtime, and they were going to tell the students, when you hear the bell telling you to go to first period, just ignore it and wait until we tell you to.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, this is
And
truly
I,
totalitarian.
yeah, 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 it's that bad, Miles. We'll get
And
to
we
you in just a minute, but I just want to relate how bad this was. This was something that I genuinely missed last time. It was very important. I was sitting there, like, as they're planning this, I was standing there like, oh God, please don't, guys, please don't do this.
but
Don't just observe.
Paul, may I interject very quickly? This does
Yeah.
remind me in a very slight way of the Stanford prison experiment. I believe we've talked
Um,
about that in the past. This is not the same at all because this is not a prison. Well, some would say it is that a school is a prison, but what I mean is it's not actually a prison in that sense, but it is a case where a set of people who don't necessarily deserve it or are not really in that capacity receive a certain amount of power. I mean, there is power
mhm.
in being the school news, I would posit, and you
Yeah.
kind of get carried away with it, and it
Yeah.
goes to your
They
head,
certainly
as they
do.
say. And so all of a
Yeah, yeah,
sudden, now that they have the possibility of doing so, even apart from their own best of intentions, they start gradually instituting these more and more totalitarian rules, and
oh
in a
yeah,
way it
oh for
makes you
sure.
wonder, like, even the Soviet Union may have started out with the best of intentions, but you know gradually it's like you put this policy in place, you put this policy in place, and before you know it you have Stalinism.
Yeah, coincidentally today I just finished reading The Lord of the Flies, which
Ah,
kind of
wow,
reminds
that
me of the
definitely,
whole
it
situation.
totally ties into this. Yes,
Slightly,
it totally flies into this.
slightly, but no real fighting. Yeah, but no real fighting or anything. But yeah, close enough. Like just
Is
throw
that
kids
go
on in the AV room and leave them alone and let them run the
is that
school. It was
is that
totally
Golding?
crazy. So I meant to, yeah,
It's
yeah,
Golding.
William Golding,
William
British,
Golding.
obviously must have been British.
Yeah, he
Yes,
was Brit.
very
I
good
believe so.
memory. Yeah, that's great. Yeah, obviously British. So what I wanted to do was segue
We should check that just to
into
be sure.
asking you about your Oh, it is. We should I wanted to segue into asking you, um, was your public access channel to any extent nearly as totalitarian, or could it even have been nearly as totalitarian and mandatorily school run as my setup? Did you hear me? Could it?
Yes,
Did you hear
I,
me?
I did. I'm waiting for the transfer of speech
Cool. Thank you.
speech
And
allowance.
and back to you, Miles.
Yes, I think it's kind of crazy, but I actually think this is kind of a cool. It's sort of a lame but cool signature. So,
All right.
for us to for us to say back to you, Miles, back to you, Paul. Anyway, but I do think it's useful ultimately. Um, so yeah, I would say there was definitely the capacity for that. I mean, it does go to your head. The thing, of course, was practically speaking, we were just a public access show, and the power that you have is so unstructured, or it's not part of a greater hierarchical structure, that there's a limited amount that you can do unless you start to gather a following, in which case it starts to form an actual hierarchical structure. Um, what I mean is, it was a show that had a sort of disconnected infloating and outfloating audience. I mean, we didn't know who was watching our show at any given time, obviously, as is the case with programs in general at that time. We don't know who's watching. Nowadays, I mean, I think you can more easily tell. You can kind of, if you really wanted to, you could check, the IP address of all your viewers. But at the time, it was a much more lo-fi situation, at least for for people who were less than hacker ability type producers. But I would say it just wasn't organized in that way. I mean, we were hosts. We had a certain influence within the local community. We were kind of hipsters on TV, but ultimately, I think people tuned in and they were kind of tickled or interested by what we were saying, but it wasn't a scenario where you get a really charismatic psycho on a podium who at first is really nothing more than a soapbox dictator. Nobody's listening to him, but over time, that ragtag group of listeners on the curbside, as he's up on the soapbox, they start to say, you know what? We're going to elect him the leader. And then this guy who stands close to the podium, they say, okay, you're going to be actually the council elder of the fan group. And slowly it starts to actually, an organic structure, a hierarchical structure starts to form. And before you know it, it becomes a political party. And then the next moment,
Mhm.
it gets voted into power. And then the next moment, all of a sudden,
Mhm.
it is the one party in a one party state. And what do you have on your hands now? So I'm saying there was nothing of that. Not, I mean, there was nothing of that course in my public access show. But what I'm saying is there is the seed of that, and really anything that anybody ever does that has any element of public access to it, even down to the humble or the modest public access show, no less than a major podcast or a major television news channel. It may be a
Mhm.
smaller audience, but you might end up influencing a violent mob within your own town, for example, or create a peaceful movement of local pastors or rabbis or what have you. So you have unknown and untold power, even as a local force. That's for sure. I mean, that's how the world works. Um, but I mean, in terms of what we were doing, it was just too unstructured for it to really go anywhere in that direction. But it definitely had the seeds of it, yes. So anyway, what can I say? Yeah, back to you,
Just a
Paul.
minute. What do you want? This?
We apologize for these technical difficulties.
This one?
Well, so what I can say is that Miles, I once had a public access show in Richmond, Virginia. I was at the time studying at VCU, Virginia Commonwealth University, and I had two shows, both one season each, under different names.
Yeah.
So it's kind of a long annals or a long sort of what's the word? Chronicle. It's a long chronicle.
I've got to think out for this.
I'm
I'll
sorry?
put myself on mute. But you can go ahead. I've got to put myself on mute. You can go ahead.
Okay, no worries. So as I was saying, ultimately I had two shows under different titles, of a different spirit as well. But how did it come to pass in the first place? Well, I had recently come to university. I didn't know what I was doing. I was very much this kind of free-spirited, neo-hippie type of teenager that would bus all over the country, writing and singing and dancing my way from town to town. I mean, I was really something else in a way. uh, I had very long hair. I mean, it was all the way down to the nether regions, and it was, curly, very thick. And I was always being told, "Oh, I wish I had your hair," by usually I would say, 30 to 40-year-old women. And I said, "Yeah, thank you." But so that was so I had very long hair, and I had these sort of sparkly button down shirts, sort of like thrift store type of material. I had bell bottoms, I had combat boots, I had a choker with spikes on it. I would sometimes put my hair up in not a man bun, but it was kind of a bun, and then I would put chopsticks in it, uh, in an X pattern. I mean, I was, like an anime character or something like that. So I was definitely, so when I say neo hippie, I wasn't really what is typically associated with neo hippies. I was definitely something on my own. I was making magical canes where, I was influenced by Alto, the French writer and dramatist Antonin Alto, who, he was kind of a, some think he was mentally ill, and but he was also a very imaginative, mystical poet. Those two things often go hand in hand. Anyway, I do remember some story. I'm not sure if I'm remembering it correctly, but it's something along the lines of, he was French. He at some point took a trip to Ireland, and he acquired this cane, which I I believe he thought it might have belonged to the prophet of Christianity, um, or who is otherwise, part of the Trinity in Catholicism, the Son. But I don't know if I'm remembering that part correctly. Maybe, but then he said at one point it belonged to uh, St. Patrick, the Irish. And there's probably no grain of truth to this, whatever. This was just his sort of internal poetic, um, you know, aesthetical reverie. another very common thing with poets, right? So anyway, he ascribed it magical powers. He thought that it was somehow, giving him these mystical abilities. Uh, and many people would just consider that to have been part of his delusions. So in my case, I had this cane, and I was writing these incantations in this sort of strange calligraphy that I developed with just a regular gel pen, and I was writing these incantations all over the cane, and I took it with me to high school. I was a nutcase in a less clinical sense than is typically associated with alto. But in any case, this is the context, so you kind of know who I was at the time. And so I had entered university basically following a very close friend of mine who we will talk about in future episodes. And I essentially followed her to that school because I didn't know where I was going to go. And it's a very curious story how I even got into VCU. It's a story unto itself. I didn't do it according to the proper channels. This was still possible at the time in the early 2000s, I guess. It was already at the point where it was almost impossible. Nowadays, I don't think this would work. Uh, Probably not. But I do recall, essentially, long story short, is that I found out she was going, my friend, and we had a very close philosophical relationship. Not to say I'm comparing us to Shams of Tabriz and Rumi, but it was sort of that kind of um, friendship, a very strong intellectual, repartee, mystical sort of friendship. And I would say I wanted to be close to that. I didn't want to lose that connection. She was going to this school. It was in our general area. It's about an hour and a half from where we live, so it wasn't that far. Uh, but it's far enough for an early friendship. So I thought, okay, I'm gonna go if I can, but I didn't send an application. I mean, the last time I had sent a college application to my memory was as sort of a joke for a class in high school where we had to actually send out college applications for our business class. I don't remember if I'm pretty sure I did do this according to the memory. Something like I filled out a college application in crayon, which I then sent to the University of Mongolia. So, sorry. Um, I apologize. So this is just one of the many hijinks that I did. I mean, there are a lot of girls and others who do this this kind of thing. Just as a kind of prank or a joke. It's not really a prank on anyone but yourself. Uh, but it extends into more serious things as well. On another occasion, when I was about 16 or 17, I got interested in Pak Pisin, which is this very curious pidgin that turned into a Creole language in Papua New Guinea. So I was really interested in this language. So I wrote a letter and I mailed it to the University of Papua New Guinea. And this is before the internet was widely popular and people were on AOL and all that, but you wouldn't have necessarily searched for the University of Papua New Guinea. So I don't even know how I got the address in this early era. So I got it somehow. Somehow I acquired the address, and I just sent them a letter saying I was a big fan of their language and did they have any kind of tutorials on this language. And another related one called Hirimotu. It's not related, but it was spoken in parallel, Police Motu or Hirimotu. So I didn't expect to ever hear from them, of course. But then about 9 months later, I was down in my, downstairs layer of the townhouse. My mother calls, says, Miles, there's some weird package here for you. It literally has like 100 stamps on it. I don't know what this is. Get up here and check this out. So, you know, I at first I was like, what could this possibly be? Because I'd forgotten about it basically. And then I go, oh my gosh, it has to be, it has to be. So I get to the top of the stairs. I can't believe my eyes. I can already tell from halfway across the room, University of Papua New Guinea. I opened it or ripped it open. I can't really remember. And I had two books. One was a tutorial on Tokpisin. The other was a tutorial on Hirimotu or police motu. And then there was this letter effusing with joyful appreciation from the staff of the University of Papua New Guinea. I don't know who exactly. It was, I think, two people co-wrote it, to my understanding. But they said, you know, dear Miles, uh, hello here, Danush. Hello. Yes, please come in. Daddy is making a recording at the moment, okay? So essentially, where was I? And they told me, we really appreciate your interest in our languages. It completely just melts our heart. Thank you so, so much for your involvement. And we wish you the best of luck on your learning and linguistic journey. And they were just, I'm not really wording it to the level of joy that they expressed in the letter. I was taken aback by how appreciative they were and how they were able to transmit that feeling in words. I always appreciate people being able to transmit emotion well in words because it's not an easy medium to do so in. So that's just another example of these crazy lengths when I was young to go, or lengths I was willing or able to go to in order to get what I was after. So anyway, back to college. I basically, how did I get into DCU? I saw that my friend was going. There was no time to go through the proper channels of actually submitting an application for that semester. So I just called the university and I said, hi, you know, my name is Miles Grejgħ. Is there any possibility of me entering the school? They said, well, have you sent an application? I said, no. They said, well, of course it's impossible then. And I said, well, is there any way that I could come down in person this week to just have some kind of informal interview, just to sort of learn a little bit about the university and what you have to offer? They said, you know, normally we don't do that. You have to go through the proper channels. But I insisted and I used my special Miles persona, which I also used incidentally as a telemarketer in later life abroad. I turned on the charm and somehow I was able to schmooze my way into an informal interview at the university. So I get down there a few days later and I made a very particular point. Well, you know, honestly, it wasn't really on purpose. I just was always carrying around these thick philosophy tomes. And I happened to be reading the German philosopher Hegel at the time. So I had this book that was about this thick, and I was carrying it under my arm like a security blanket. And I walk into the interview. The woman says, you know, all right, so, you know, tell me a little bit about yourself. So I said, okay, well, I am interested in going to this university because of this, this, and this. I'd done my research. She asked, you know, what is this book that you have? I said, oh, it's nothing. She said, no, tell me, tell me. And I said, no, this is it's just a philosophy book, Hegel. You're reading Hegel? And, you know, so this turned into a whole thing. And she asked me, well, what do you hope to get out of an academic experience at this university? And I told her, you again, using this schmooze master charm. And by the end of this informal interview, it had turned into a formal interview. You know, Frank Abagnale comes to mind. Okay, I sound like a total, a total, a total, you know, what is the word? Self-centered. That's not the word. A narcissistic personality disorder type guy, but that's really not it. It's just that there was some element of con manicity to this deed. But in the end, it turned into a kind of formal interview. And I didn't do it on purpose. It just kind of happened. Okay, that's the thing I should mention. And by the end of the interview, she says, okay, Miles, I have got to tell you that come this fall, you will be coming to this university. You're in. And I said, what? But I haven't even filled out an application. She said, it's all right. You're coming. And then that was it. And I was in. I didn't even have to fill out an application. I don't, and I like I said, I don't think that's even possible today. I couldn't believe it. I mean, it was kind of shocking, honestly. So anyway, I get to university under these circumstances. And in the pretty early days as a freshman, there was this guy who I only remember as being called Redbeard. Now, Redbeard was this rather portly fellow. He had an actual red beard. He kind of looked like a pirate, a hipster pirate. And he was like a very ill-adjusted, rather mean kid. He was a bully, like a classic bully. But he was hipster and cool and ironic enough, especially this was in the early 2000s, right? The aughts, the early aughts, that he had a certain flair, you know. There was almost something of this grunge style indifference, you know. So he had that element, and even though he was sort of this mean bully, he ended up gathering a following. So this was the very thing. This is a sort of an instance of, or an instantiation of what we were talking about before. How does a group or a show or a person start to gather a following and become more powerful than they should be? You know, Redbeard was a case in point. This guy, he was just a random bully who showed up. I mean, he was a kid who had no self-esteem, but he was able to fake it. So he started to gather this following. What were they initially infamous for? Well, they would be down in the TV room of the dormitory on campus, and they would watch these old shows, kind of like Mystery Theater. What is it called? Mystery Theater 2000 or 3000? I forgot what that show was. Do you remember that?
MST 3.
Yeah, that's so it was sort of in that style where he and his goons would sit around on the sofas and the armchairs in the TV room of the hall of the I don't even remember the name of the hall, that particular dormitory. I'm sure it will come to me in a moment, but anyway, I don't want to dwell on that. So they would sit around the TV, they'd watch these old movies, and they would just make fun of it. And I don't really remember too many of the actual clever things they said, but I do remember one. I remember specifically, I have this image in my mind, this memory where Redbeard is sitting with his goons watching some old cowboy, like an old spaghetti western or something. And this guy, well, it couldn't have been that. It must have been a kung fu movie then, because anyway, a guy gets his head cut off in the movie. And I remember that Redbeard says, oh, a cranial bris. A bris meaning, of course, the Jewish ritual of circumcision, Brit Milah. So that's where you remove the foreskin, of course. And so cranial referring to the head. So cranial bris. And that was rather clever, I thought. But you know, he said it with such a goonish, bullyish manner that it was like, oh, and it was like that ironic, sarcastic hipster of the early aughts kind of mannerism that it was just disgusting at the same time. It wasn't even the words that were disgusting, it was the attitude. And of course, all his goons just roared with laughter at his most amazing joke. So anyway, he invited me to be on their show. What was it called? The Wednesday Night Karate Explosion. That was the name of their public access show for public access Richmond. They invited me, they were stringing me along. Basically, Redbeard strung me along for quite a number of months, I would say. And he was like, oh, you're going to be, first he told me I would be on their panel, a regular on the show. It was sort of a talk show and they would interview people. I think, or I don't know if they interview people, but it was a talk show on public access. A bunch of goons sitting around just shooting the you know what. And then after that, I was no longer eligible to be on the panel. But now they said, okay, you can at least be a guest and we'll interview you on one episode. I said, okay, I'll settle for that. I mean, that's not what you told me initially. Anyway, that never came to pass either, not to my surprise. And I thought, these people have strung me along. I feel like I'm just that I let it happen. I feel like I feel stupid. Why would I let them string me along in this way? Well, this is classic bully behavior. Get my hopes up only to drop me. So what did I do? I said, you know what? What is the best way to show him up, or to fight back to the bully in this particular circumstance? And so what I did is I marched down to that TV station. It was AJ, I recall. AJ, I said, is there any possibility that I could get my own public access show as close as possible to the Wednesday Night Karate Explosion slot? And to my recollection, they gave me he said yes, and they gave me a slot. I don't remember if it was within an hour of their show or if it was the next day. I think it might have been the day after. Like theirs was Wednesday and mine was Thursday, but I'm mixing it up because of the seasons. But anyway, what did I call my show? Well, it had to be something comparable to the Wednesday Night Karate Explosion, but something all my own. So I came up with the Technicolor Freedom Machine. So the Technicolor Freedom Machine made its debut within a few weeks of my realizing that I would not actually appear on the Wednesday Night Karate Explosion under the auspices of Redbeard. And he was shocked in a bad way, but which was a good way for me, when he realized that I had gotten a show. He had no idea about it, of course, until it debuted. And I don't know how they knew, but somehow someone, this was a close college community. Someone must have seen it and said, Redbeard, get over here. You got to see this. I'm sure it was something like this. Some guy in his room, traveling the high route, and he's on the public access channel, just sort of dazed and confused, and then says, oh my gosh, that's that guy, Redbeard, get in here. That's how I imagined it likely happened, that he came to realize that I had my own show now. And our show became quite popular, actually. I dare say more popular than his, which I will say this was a dynasty of miscreants. So it started out with a guy called, I believe his name was Gorgeous George. He was a locally famous, sort of a locally famous public access legend. And then Wednesday Night Karate Explosion came in his wake, and then in the Wednesday Night Karate Explosion's wake came my show, the Technicolor Freedom Machine. But mine was like a revenge show, in a way, in good fun. So it's not real revenge exactly, but it's so it was a show. It was my girlfriend at the time, plus a number of other sort of friends and associates, companions, and we had hot sauce drinking contests. I was a participant in that. That was a horrible experience. I think I kind of won, but if you want to call that winning, I mean, I was sick. I was sick. And not the thing is, I wasn't sick over a toilet. I was just, it felt like my stomach was just oily. That was the feeling I recall. It wasn't about it even being hot. It was just like an oily feeling. That was terrible. Uh, inside, yeah, an oily feeling inside. Anyway, so that was, and it was kind of a silly show. We didn't really talk much about anything. I mean, Seinfeld is often described itself as a show about nothing, right? In reference to the original reference within the show, that influenced that actual show. But you may know the history. You can look it up if you don't know it yet. But um, in a way, this was actually a show about nothing. the Technicolor Freedom Machine. And this lasted for the season. We started to gather a bit of a following. It was people making fun of us to begin, but it did actually get something of a fandom locally. But after that season ended, the Wednesday Night Karate Explosion, I don't think they even continued into the next season. That relationship ended, unfortunately, and I kind of lost that circle of companions. And I was a much more lonely sort of lone wolf character in the next season. So I decided to create my own show, much more serious and politically attuned, and that was called The Schwartzman Politic. And there are 2 episodes, in fact, of The Schwartzman Politic that are still up on YouTube to this day. And we can provide the links if you're interested. And you can find them on my other channel as well. So brilliant stuff. I mean, this is so lo-fi and so local and so public accessy. But you can see when my chopstick era on the show, you can see my Australian Crocodile Dundee era. Uh, we had quite a show. So that show, there was a fair amount of us being made fun of. There's the mini chronicle of Cave Metal, which was a guy I knew in college who literally officially legally changed his name to Cave Metal. And I knew him kind of, and his girlfriend, who then I was later kind of talking to, which was the term back in those days. And I mean, what was it that happened? I mean, I didn't know him very well, but I just remember that Cave Metal, somebody saying he was Cave Metal would call into the public access show, and they would flush the toilet on like live. They would say, "Oh, hi, is this Miles?" And then they would flush the toilet, and then they they would get off, or they would call and say, "Hey, I'm a big fan of the show. We love your show," and then they would make some flatulent sound, and they would say, "Joke's on you, fool," and then they would and they would hang up on you or make some vulgar sound. But we also had serious callers, and it was sort of reminiscent to some of the Howard Stern prank calls where they would call into these kinds of public access shows. But some of the stuff we did was actually pretty cool, I think, in my estimation. As I said, important things really do happen on the local level. So that's what I'm saying. We may have been local, but I think we did have a reasonable effect. We were talking about things that nobody else was talking about. We were talking about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. We were talking about all manner of things that you wouldn't necessarily expect to hear on public access at that time. And so that was really something. And we were edgy enough to get people on the phone, calling in, people arguing, people giving their point of view, their 2 cents. I mean, it got some buzz. And there's nothing like that local Richmond buzz, that public access buzz. So anyway, somebody impersonating Cave Metal would call in from time to time. I thought it might be the real Cave Metal. I contacted the real Cave Metal about 10 years later, asking if that was him calling in. He said no. I sent him the original recording, and he said, "Oh my gosh, I can't believe somebody was impersonating me in college and I never knew about it. That's so funny." Because that's the thing, despite his name being Cave Metal, he's a pretty reasonable, logical, stolid guy. But the fake Cave Metal was a very silly, rambunctious, absurd clown. So really interesting. And his name wasn't actually Cave Metal. I'm sure the fake Cave Metal had a much more conservative sounding name. So anyway, that's the story in a nutshell of my 2 public access shows in Richmond, Virginia, circa the early aughts.